Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Not in a talking mood, I see. Let us start again. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Seems we didn't have a good night's rest. Ladies and gentlemen, I really have to start by thanking the organizers, in particular Professor Munandulo, Jackie, and all the people who worked behind the scenes to make this symposium possible, and the sponsors, and all the people, as I said, who made this symposium possible. For me, this is a special occasion, not because I've met a number of interesting people, but it's because this is my first visit to the United States of America. I've been to many countries. I've been to China, I've been to Germany, I lived in Germany, I've been to Mexico, but I was never here, so this is very special for me, and I felt I had to say this. Today, I will be addressing you on the future of aid as a financing mechanism, a social protection perspective. Now, yesterday we had 3 impressive presentations. They were not only impressive on the basis of the content or how the presenters presented their papers, but it's also how the PowerPoint presentations were put together. Impressive graphs, impressive, I don't know, I'm a lawyer by training, what to call that, those formulas with M's facing different directions. I do not have graphs. I do not mean to insult the people who work in those areas. You know what it means. That me as a lawyer, I didn't know, but I understood most of the information said. The point I'm trying to make here is that do not be disappointed when you don't see any graphs in my PowerPoint presentations or those fancy formulas. The idea is not to lower standards, but just to bring variety on this Saturday morning. Ladies and gentlemen, my paper has got 3 main sections. I will be sweet and short, with the hope that we'll have interesting discussions at the end. The first part is a general background about what social protection is and all those. The second part, I will look at the multilateral, bilateral donor agencies from a social, they are linked to social protection on the African continent. And lastly, there will be some conclusions and a few recommendations. Now, by way of general background, I asked the question, what is social protection? There are a number of definitions offered, ladies and gentlemen, by different organizations, the Asian Development Bank, the Southern African Development Community, and so on. But I found one interesting and recent definition provided by Berry. Berry describes social protection as follows. He or she refers to social protection refers to the set of policies and programs designed to reduce poverty and vulnerability by promoting efficient labor markets, diminishing people's exposure to risks, enhancing their capacity to protect themselves against hazards and interruption or loss of income. Now, those who work in this area, you have probably noticed that social protection is used more often today than social security. Social protection is preferred as a concept these days because it's broader than social security. Even the International Labour Organization has acknowledged that. The point is that social protection includes or encompasses social security and services as well as developmental social welfare. It is not restricted to protection against income security caused by particular social risks. Social security has been defined or is normally being defined in relation to the so-called 9 classical risks. And as a result, it excludes certain risks that are experienced by people, by communities, particularly in the developing world. So social protection is much broader than that. It's not restricted to those 9 classical risks, which include unemployment, old age, death, and so on. Sub-Article 4 of the Code on Social Security in the SADC region, that is the Southern African Development Region, the region that I'm coming from, says social protection refers to public and private or to mixed public and private measures designed to protect individuals against life cycle crises that curtail their capacity to meet their needs. Now, this is more about protecting individuals against risks, and so for that reason, it's not surprising that social protection is regarded as a human right. You can see that when you look at a number of national constitutions, when you look at regional standards, and when you also look at international instruments. I have a couple of examples from Africa. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, Section 27 of that Constitution reads as follows. It says in subsection 1, everyone has the right to have access to healthcare services, including reproductive health care, sufficient food and water, and social security, including, if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents, appropriate social assistance. And if you look at the Kenyan Constitution at section 43, it says that every person has the right to the highest attainable standard of health, which includes the right to health care services, including reproductive health care. Everyone has a right to accessible and adequate housing and to reasonable standards of sanitation, to be free from hunger and to have adequate food of acceptable quality, to clean and safe water in adequate quantities. Every person has a right to social security and to education. But these are exceptions, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at this when you look at constitutions in a number of African countries. With this approach, we say they choose to follow the so-called rights-based approach. And based on this approach, social protection should not and is not a favor that the intended recipients or those who receive social protection benefits should be grateful for. It's a right, it's an entitlement that can be claimed. But now, this does not mean this right is absolute, because it can be limited by the lack of resources or limited resources. This is interesting, and I chose to refer to this and use these two constitutions, particularly the South African one, because by taking these routes, governments are saying, we want you to hold us accountable if we do not live up to the promise contained in the Constitution. We saw a lot happening in my country, South Africa, where individuals supported by NGOs and so on would go to the Constitutional Court and demand that their right to social security be complied with, which is extremely important. Of course, politicians do not like this. In other countries on the African continent, it's not a rare thing to find a separate section. In comparison with this right is in the Bill of Rights. But in some countries like Malawi, you have a separate section with the so-called state principles of social policy and all that, which are not enforceable. And this affects, of course, the provision for this right to social security or social protection. Somebody asked an important question that in other countries where this is not provided as a fundamental right, if they were to do that, to say for a change that we provide this as a fundamental right in our Bill of Rights, will this be enforceable? Firstly, will people go to court? Will people have the guts to go to court and demand that their right to social protection be respected by governments? If they are brave enough, the second question would be, will the courts be brave enough to say, you as the government failed to provide social protection? If the judges are brave enough to say, yes, the government hasn't provided, the last question would be, will those governments comply with court orders? So these are some of the things that one needs to keep in mind. Examples of regional standards that make provision for social protection as a fundamental right. I once again chose to use the Southern African Development Community as an example. We have the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the SADC and the Code on Social Security. At an international level, there are a number of instruments, which include the Income Recommendation of 1944, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, what are the objectives of social protection? protection. The first one is to avert or minimize social risks. And as I've said, social protection is a fundamental right, so it makes sense that the aim is also to enable human beings to live with dignity, to live as human beings. The United Nations Commission has gone as far as stating, and rightfully so, that social protection is the foundation at a societal level for three things: promoting social justice and social cohesion, developing human capabilities, and promoting economic dynamism and creativity. Others went as far as saying social protection is instrumental for ensuring human and economic development. And there's also a nice example, especially when we look back at the recent economic crisis, where social protection has proved itself as an important and effective crisis response mechanism. We saw that in a number of African countries that activated their social protection mechanisms to help individuals cope with the recent financial crisis. Now, so far, it's clear that social protection is a human right, or I said it's a human right, is important. Social protection has a role to play in ensuring that human beings live with dignity. But what is the situation on the African continent in terms of the coverage? Ladies and gentlemen, social protection coverage, or the scope of social protection coverage in Africa is very limited. Or maybe I should say extremely limited. 5 to 10% of the working population enjoys some form of social security in sub-Saharan Africa. Social security coverage in middle-income African countries range from 20% to 60% of the population. So as a result, there are high incidences of, firstly, let me say, why do we have this situation? And I was so glad yesterday, Professor Tobik, when he presented the keynote address, he did highlight some of these challenges which are relevant to what I'm about to say. A lot of people are excluded and marginalized from the social protection mechanisms, largely because of the high incidences of informal sector employment and also small-scale subsistence farming. The point is, or the situation is as follows. Often to be protected by social protection mechanisms in most African countries, you have to be employed in the formal sector. And we heard yesterday that how much? 63% of individuals or persons in Africa are employed in the vulnerable sector. So they are not covered. If you are not employed in the formal sector, or you're not even a civil servant, it means you will not be covered by the system, particularly the so-called contributory mechanisms where you have to contribute, employers have to make some core contributions. Then this leaves individuals to what? Government-provided cash transfers, which are not that well developed, and there aren't many of those in the on the African continent. The challenge we are now facing is how can we extend the scope of social protection coverage to the excluded and marginalized members of our communities. Now I'll move on to the issue of multilateral and bilateral agencies and social protection. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a need for social protection. We have heard now, a lot of people are excluded, they are not covered. But I guess at some point or another, all of us here today have heard about the challenges that African countries have to deal with. High unemployment, especially youth unemployment. High incidences of poverty, HIV/AIDS, and so on. So really there's a need for social protection mechanisms to help people cope with challenges. But social protection requires resources that are not always available. Countries would say, governments in Africa would say, yeah, well, this requires resources and we do not have. If we had enough resources, we would definitely provide some form of protection. And I ask the question, yes, resources may not be available, or the resources available may not be that adequate to provide social protection in a meaningful way for all those who need it. But does that mean social protection is unaffordable? That is a different story completely, ladies and gentlemen. And recent studies conducted by the International Labour Organization confirms that social protection is affordable. And there are other examples that I wish to share with you today. Ethiopia, for example, spends about 1.2% of its GDP on the National Safety Net Program. Mauritius spends about 4.4% of GDP on social assistance. Namibia, our neighbor, so our meaning South Africa's neighbor, spends 1.8% of GDP on its social grant system. And South Africa, my country, we spend 3.4% of the GDP on social grants. Just to put things into perspective, in South Africa today, almost 16 million individuals are covered by our social grant system. So that 3.4% covers about 16 million individuals. Of course, we said there is a need, and this is where donor agencies, aid organization come into play. They want to help African countries deal with this need, and a lot have dedicated portions of their aid to social protection or social protection related issues. And what they really want to see include poverty alleviation, promotion of inclusive growth, and advancement of human rights. Remember, social protection, as I said earlier, is a human right. Is a human right. But there are constraints and challenges that needs to be dealt with within this aid framework, using aid as a social protection funding mechanism. The first bullet there concerns the issue of predictable or sustained funding for social protection. Social protection requires resources, as I said, that are not always readily available. But now, as a human right, you cannot provide social protection sometimes, because when donors, with their aid, they provide resources for a certain time, and then it stops. There are lots of pilots projects that end in the middle, and then there's nothing that goes on. So there's a need for permanent and predictable sources of funding. But donors cannot always provide that forever. Countries have to come in, step in and start doing something. We saw that other countries, not even a single country of those that I've mentioned, spent 5% of their GDP on social protection, even the poorest of the poor. Lesotho, for example, introduced with its own resources. It's one of the poorest countries in Africa. With its own resources, introduced the old age grant. That is an example. Another issue here is because funding is not predictable, recipient governments are often reluctant to launch donor-funded social protection programs out of fear of being expected to scale that up, and that is often difficult for such governments. There's an issue of donor politics and competition. It raises the question, with this aid, who should drive social protection initiatives? Remember, these initiatives are implemented at local level, at national level, at government level, but often aid agencies try to drive the implementation, which is often problematic, because there are cases where it was reported that the priorities set by governments are not always taken into account by aid agencies. Another issue which is well known involves the competition among donors. Instead of working together, then competing against each other. National conditions and issues which are always not taken into account. There are several implementing ministries. You have the Ministry of Labor, Ministries of Social Development, Social Welfare, and then you have Treasury on the side. That in some instances you find that they work against each other, and the problem comes from the fact that Treasury works mainly with the World Bank and the IMF, which may push for a certain kind of scheme, particularly contributory schemes. The Department of Labor, Social Development work closely with the ILO, which may push for cash transfers. Then you find internal conflicts which have to be managed carefully. Lastly, the alignment of donor priority strategies with recipient countries is extremely important, because this, at the end of the day, avoids problems of ownership and accountability, which has to be taken into account going forward. Now, in conclusion, I have a couple of conclusions here and recommendations. It is clear, ladies and gentlemen, that aid ranks high in many African countries as a social protection funding mechanism. And scaling up of social protection in some low-income countries is possible. Rwanda is a perfect example. With the donors' money or donor aid, they introduced a healthcare program, health insurance program. At the beginning, it cost about 2% of the GDP. Now it's 10%. And with the right support, they're doing well. By the way, Rwanda a few years ago won an award from the International Social Security Association for best practice in the field of social protection based on this. So it can be done. Without aid, it's clear that in many countries, many individuals and families would be much more destitute. But now the question is, how do we ensure that the donor agencies get more bang for the buck, and at the same time ensure that there's sustainability and continuity? Here, my view is that donor agencies need to help with startup costs. Look at what governments are doing, like the government of Lesotho, after introducing the old age pension out of its own money, support that with, for example, program design, ensuring that the financial delivery systems work well, and there's capacity building. That way then will ensure sustainability and ensure that these programs continue. But at the same time, I'm not saying they shouldn't fund temporary or cyclical social assistance schemes. This should be used, but not as the main way or main approach. This could be used, for example, we have public works which could be used during economic downturns to have individuals. But that should not be something that is used forever. We need to have some form of sustainability. And lastly, I have the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness of 2005 and the Accra Agenda for Action of 2008. Now, I put it there to say donor agencies need to be reminded of these two important documents, because these have been concluded long ago, have been put out there long ago, but we still have the same problems that these documents intend to address, like competition between donors, lack of respect for national priorities, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.